We'll get started in just a second here. It looks like we have one person online. We'll see if anybody else jumps on and then we'll get going. Right, it's 5 after, so we'll go ahead and get started. We have one resident here in the room and we have one online. So if either of you would like to talk, if you're online, if you could just use the raise hand function and we can call on you and allow you to speak. And in the room, if you'd like to say anything, let us know and we'll give you a microphone. You'll need to use that so that they can hear you online. We are recording this as well. So anybody that isn't here this evening has the ability to watch the presentation. So this is a continuation of the discussion that we've been having about the proposed project on the west side of the Concordia campus, along with the South 40 on the WashU campus. So I always start by talking about the purpose of zoning. And so it's really important to understand what zoning seeks to regulate. And those are three things: use, intensity, and bulk. And so when we're talking about the use of land or buildings, we're talking about just that. How is the ground, the property going to be utilized? So they generally go into broad categories, like is it commercial or residential, or in this case, institutional type uses. And then you can break it down further than that. So if we're talking about residential, is it multifamily? Is it single family? Because those are two very different things, but those all get into the use of the property. The intensity means just that, how that property is going to be utilized. How intense is the use? How much traffic might be created? Are there other nuisances it could potentially create? And then if you're thinking about that example of residential, a multifamily tower is much more intense than a single family home would be on a piece of property, even with the same footprint. So that's what we talk about when we're talking about the intensity of the use. And then finally, the bulk of the use. And the bulk gets into the design characteristics of the structures on the site. So how much of the ground are they actually taking up? How tall is the building? How close to property lines is it? That's what we're talking about when we regulate bulk. And we do that through our design standards, which we'll talk about in a little bit. The current zoning for the area, you can see on the map here. Again, as we've talked about during this process, it's zoned single family residential, and that goes for the South 40 campus and the Concordia Seminary property, where we'll talk about the athletic and recreational uses that are proposed for the site. But the thing to take away here is that the zoning is the same, whether you're in Hillcrest or you're up in this area, as it is for those institutional properties. So we are currently regulating institutions using single family zoning, which is quite unusual. It's not a situation you really see anywhere else. And the way we've done that traditionally is through the use of conditional use permits, meaning when a use is proposed, they have to come before the Plan Commission and the Board of Aldermen and go through a process where the Board of Aldermen can consider conditions on the approval that mitigate any potential impacts to the surrounding area. So the important thing to know there is that conditional uses are assumed to be permitted. So the use itself is appropriate for the property, but we recognize that there may be elements of that use that we might want to further regulate through those conditions. And so rather than going through the conditional use process for each phase of this particular project, it's our recommendation, and we've been working for some time to explore an overlay district, both for the South 40 and for the Big Bend area, which is the western side of the Concordia campus. And the reason we want to do that, of course, is to have a long-term phased approach to the development of those properties to make it very predictable for everyone involved. So not just the institutions, but for the city itself, but most importantly for the residents in the area. So you know what the extent of development could be in those particular areas, how tall the buildings might be, what the specific uses may be on the property. We can regulate all of those things and really customize it or tailor it to what's been proposed on those sites and make sure that we're mitigating potential negative impacts along the way. So as we seek to put together overlay districts, the most important thing is this first sentence here, which is preserving the neighborhood character and the quality of life for nearby residents. And that's the reason we're going through this public process here. I'm sorry. Oh, okay, great. It looks like it's being shared out online, but not shown in the room. Thank you for pointing that out. Okay, so I can go back one. And just so you can see the zoning map here with the bright yellow color, that's the single family residential zoning that I was referring to. The sites that we're talking about, we're primarily going to talk about this area here today, being that it's adjacent to HiPointe and DeMun, which is the subject of this meeting, but also the South 40 campus, which is also subject to a proposed overlay. You can see that the zoning for those properties is that bright yellow, which is again is single family residential, as are those surrounding neighborhoods. And so those overlay district parameters, as I was saying, first, we want to seek to preserve the neighborhood character and the quality of life. And the three primary concerns that we hear all the time, not just with this particular project, but any project, are that residents don't want to see it, they don't want to hear it, and they don't want traffic or parking in their neighborhoods. Typically, those are the three primary things that you need to solve for when you're considering putting something like this together. And so we do that, for instance, if you don't want to see it, through regulating building heights by having transition zones, which we'll talk about in a little bit, and also have specialized regulations as it relates to lighting. Don't want to hear it, we can have measures in place for decibel limits. And then again, setbacks. So how far is a building from a property line has an impact on sound, as do those transition zones or buffers. And then finally, you don't want traffic or parking in your neighborhoods. We understand all of that, certainly. So we make sure that we have proper access points to the site, and then also the convenient on-site parking so that uh, participants in those activities or spectators, they're not tempted to park in surrounding neighborhoods and then walk onto the site. And there are ways that we can control that. So as far as the overall area plan, just to get familiar with the area, the Washington University Danforth campus or main campus is up here on the north side of Forsyth, bound by Forsyth and Forest Park Parkway in the north and south, and then Skinker to the east, Big Bend to the west. That's actually not located within the city of Clayton. That's located within unincorporated St. Louis County. The South 40 site is at the corner of Forsyth and Big Bend. That's where they currently have a baseball field, a softball field. They have residence halls, dormitories, dining halls, a bookstore, a number of different uses on South 40 that support the uses on the Danforth campus. And then the Concordia Seminary site, which we'll talk about quite a bit tonight, is located right here on Big Bend. We're specifically going to be talking about, or primarily the western side of the site, where we are seeking to consider this overlay, and then down to the south here on Clayton Road. Another site that's important to talk about because there are some uses that would be impacted by recreational activity here is the former CBC site, or the South Campus that Washington University has. So the first step of this entire project or proposal, the first phase, if you will, is the relocation of the housing on the Concordia Seminary property. So right now, there's a lot of multifamily and some single family housing that's located off of Founders Way, interior to their site. And so the first step would be, because those buildings need to be replaced in the near future, would be to move all of those facilities to the center part of the Concordia Seminary site, closer to their primary structures. And so once those buildings shift to the central part of the Concordia site, it then opens up that western side of the campus for other uses. And in this particular case, Washington University is proposing to move their athletic uses to that particular ground. With the athletic uses coming to this ground, you're actually freeing up the intramural field that's here on the South 40 campus. There's also a gymnasium that's located on that site. And you're also freeing up on the South 40 campus the area where the baseball and softball fields are located. So the idea would then be to backfill that space on the South 40 with a reconfiguration of dormitories on the site and similar uses. And then hopefully the CBC site, if the uses all move off of it, then our long-term hope would be that would be put back on the private market potentially and be considered for redevelopment. So at the last meeting that we had that was at the high school, we didn't have a whole lot of information about how the site might be utilized. Wanted to talk for a minute tonight about some conceptual test fits that we have for the property. And the idea isn't to show specifically what might happen. As you can see, there are 8 different scenarios here. None of these are really engineered, so they're not taking topography and other things into account. But what these demonstrate really well is once you move a baseball field, a softball field, parking, the intramural fields, maybe some tennis courts and a gym onto this site, there's not much ground left over for anything else. So I think there's been some concern that, this is a really big piece of property. You can put those fields and other things on it, but there's still going to be room to put other buildings in the future, and they might try to put dorms there or other things. And as you can see, the site becomes filled up really quickly once you add the transition zones or buffers to the edges of the site and then put these large fields on it. So here's a couple that are just zoomed in a little bit. So you can see just some different layouts or scenarios. This one has a baseball field at the north, softball in the middle, a gymnasium building here, a soccer field. This one has a tennis court here, baseball and softball, more on the eastern side of the site. And again, these are purely conceptual, but they really show you how much of this site gets utilized and very quickly once you start putting the athletic uses on it. So to talk a little bit about uses, again, we currently allow institutional uses. We allow colleges and universities and essentially all of their support functions in our single family zoning with that conditional use approval. So again, really important to realize that right now, today, we allow institutions in the single family district. So if Washington University or Concordia came to us today with a conditional use permit to do something on their site, that use would be considered to be permitted at that point. We would just need to figure out what the potential nuisances the property might create. And if we could figure out what's any kind of negative impacts we may have, then we could seek to mitigate those by putting conditions. But you can see we allow right now as a primary use colleges and university, provided that buildings shall not occupy more than 1/3 of the site, and the height, location, and use do not have a serious and depreciating effect on adjacent residential property. And when we're talking about athletic fields, you're not going to meet, or you are going to comfortably meet that 1/3 area requirement because those aren't actually buildings. If they're just building a gym, then they would certainly fall in this category where it would be essentially a permitted use, given our ability to put conditions on it through that conditional use process. And then again, accessory uses, this language is just really wide open. This is anything that may go to support the primary use on the site, which again is the use of that land for a college or a university. So that's what we have on the books right now. And you can see there's not much specificity as to what type of institutional use that may be. So, we don't say specifically dorms are okay and classrooms are okay and athletic uses are okay. We really say anything related to the institutions themselves would be permissible. And so in building an overlay, we want to get very specific, much more than we currently are with the proposed permitted uses or the uses that would be allowed. We want to start by saying any use not expressly listed as approved or primary shall be prohibited. So if it's not on the list of approved uses, then we wouldn't consider it for this particular site or allow it. The permitted uses, and these bullets are somewhat similar. They need to be for the use of students, for faculty, for visitors to the site. So they couldn't put, for instance, a restaurant on a busy corner with a drive-through that's meant to serve the public and generate revenue for the university. It needs to go to support the uses that they have on the ground. And be used for the university, used by the university patrons. As far as the overlay itself, the proposed primary uses that we have in the draft version right now for the Big Bend overlay, which again is the west portion of the Concordia site, it's just two things: athletic and recreational facilities, be they indoor, outdoor, and playgrounds. And those are the two primary uses that are permitted. To support those primary uses, we have a number of accessory uses, and this is where we really want feedback from the public as to what types of accessory uses may be acceptable or unacceptable or what causes concern. But there's a list of 15 items here, and you can see we have offices related to the athletics or recreation on the site, athletic events, including competition and practice, auditoriums, band playing and practice, commencement concession facilities, gymnasiums, health and medical care, again, related to athletics, parking lots. You're going to need parking on the site, so we capture that here. Lectures, speakers, musical performances or cultural events, campus events, temporary buildings or structures. The solar and wind energy we actually have throughout our code. It's allowed in any district, so we wanted to be very clear that it's allowed here as well. And then 15 is really a catch-all provision, and we're still working on the language a little bit here. But any other accessory use or facility that is common to a private university and deemed to have similar or lesser impacts as uses listed may be approved by the Plan Commission. So if there's something not on this list that they may think of that is in keeping with the other items on the list and doesn't have a negative impact, we could send that to the Plan Commission for consideration, and they would need to approve it in order for that use to go in. And again, we're still looking at that language and seeing if that could be tweaked a little bit. We have received some comments on it. So any comments that the public may have about primary accessory uses, we certainly want to hear that. As far as the events that may be on the site, and again, this was in our first meeting, which was a meeting with the Tuscany neighborhood. We had quite a bit of discussion about this. As far as events on the site, if it had 3,000 people, at that point, we would require a special event permit. If there's a special event permit application that comes to the city, it's going to tell us how parking, how traffic are going to be handled, what the hours of operations are going to be, what kind of vendors they may have, whether or not there's going to be music. So we have some idea of what's going to be there, and then we can prepare accordingly on the city end. And then we also have the second bullet here that's very clearly stated, and it's in the draft ordinance. which is events or activities cannot exceed 5,000 attendees or participants. So in no case could they go over that number. And just to give you an idea, 3,000 to 5,000 people is typically what we would get through the extent of like the wine festival that the city has. Jazz Fest, we see numbers in that 3 to 5 range. So if you're trying to picture here in Clayton what that number of people may be like on the ground, it would be an event like that. And currently that's held on Carondelet Plaza, which is certainly a smaller site than what we have here. But that should give you a general sense of what kind of crowd that may be. And that's the absolute maximum. So I do want to be clear. This isn't something that we foresee happening on a regular basis. And the university has been very clear that they don't expect to see this on a regular basis. But if they did have some sort of event, these would be the rules that would be in place for it. And I'm going to turn it over to Anna Crane, our Director of Development, Planning and Development Services, to go through the site design standards. So at the beginning, I talked about use and intensity and bulk, and this is where we're really going to get into the bulk or the design characteristics that we have built into the overlay. So I'll turn it over to Anna.
Okay, thanks. And feel free to jump in if you have questions as we go through this. So we're summarizing what we went over at the larger community meeting. So on the screen here, we have a table that summarizes our lot coverage and building height regulations. So as David mentioned, now we're getting into the physical development of what you'll see on the property. Currently, we have front yard and total lot coverage for the R2 district that come into play with the proposed uses under the conditional use permit. Under the overlay, we are modifying that. So as opposed to separating out front yard, it's just total lot. For Big Bend, the maximum would be 40%. So that's a decrease from the 55% with up to 60 with plan commission approval that's allowed on site today. A big part of that is the main use of this property is athletic fields as opposed to buildings. And so through the site engineering, we'll be able to achieve a more pervious site. We also have a regulation that site shall be designed so as not to increase the amount of stormwater runoff that currently is on site. And so that's a big one that protects our neighborhoods to the south based on the natural topography of the land, that they would have to show us through the engineered drawings that there isn't going to be additional stormwater runoff that is left over the property line with the improvements. And then for building heights, currently the maximum is 2 stories or 30 feet for R2 single family. But this use of college or university can go up to 110 feet when they increase their setback requirements based on the height of the proposed building. So 110 feet is a significantly taller building than the context of the R2 district. So in order to address that, we are separating out building height and setbacks. So here we're proposing a lower building height of 6 stories or 90 feet, and that would be the maximum. And then we have setbacks separately. So if the building is only 30 feet tall, it would be subject to the same setbacks as a 90-foot tall building. Site access. This is another one that we've heard a lot about in our different various discussions with the neighborhood and the community meetings. So currently South 40 appears where most of the university activity is. And a big part is how will we translate or connect South 40 and the Danforth campus down to the proposed Big Bend overlay. The primary means of transportation that we want to support is bike and ped. So walking and biking as we go down. So you can see here that we're highlighting requirements of the proposed site access in order to do that. So right now under the R2 district and under the CUP process, there aren't any prescriptive regulations for how vehicles, pedestrians, or bicyclists will access the site. So through the overlay process, we're able to write in regulations on how the development overall is handled. So what we're doing here is we're going to propose to write in primary vehicle access on Big Bend. So that means that the main way any vehicle or bus would enter the site would be through this proposed access point, which David will get into more details about the traffic analysis for that. And then we can also write out vehicle access points. So secondary access for vehicles, That is allowed through the eastern boundary. Should Concordia and Washi want to have vehicle access between their two properties, it would be allowed through this district, but is not required. Whereas that primary access point on Big Bend is proposed to be required. And then we also can limit it so that emergency access only would be provided through the southern property line. So currently there is an access point here for emergencies that's provided through, again, some private property that Concordia owns right now that connects down to, I believe this is San Benito. So we would allow that to be maintained should it be needed, but we're not requiring it. And then similarly, we can prohibit the vehicle access from the northern point. So we heard this a lot from Hillcrest. We don't want vehicle access. They didn't want that through their neighborhood off of Dartford. So we're able, again, to write that into the code that we're proposing here. At the same time with with pedestrians and bicyclists, again, that primary access point, we can write in that as a requirement from the northwestern corner to connect to the existing university campuses to the north. So that's required here. And then we also have it unlimited. So you could they could have additional vehicle or pedestrian bicycle access points from any other part of the site for this overlay district, in addition to the required access points along Big Bend. Transition zones, this is another new concept that we're proposing within our overlay district requirements. So transition zones are going to be defined specifically within these overlay districts to provide a landscape buffer along the edges of these institutions. So as opposed to right now where we have setback requirements in our code, other elements of improvements such as surface parking, athletic fields, other grading, other playground areas, things might be allowed to be closer to a property line than our current without current setback requirements. So the transition zone is a way of really maintaining that natural protected area, which will help with site buffering as well as noise buffering, and also, again, just protect that kind of existing landscape that we have. And so we're limiting buildings, parking lots, garages, pretty much anything other than the desired screening and some minimal access points for vehicles, pedestrians, and bicyclists. So the transition zones vary slightly for depending on where you are within the area. So in order to get to where we are with our proposed transition zones, we did an analysis of the existing conditions on the site. So within the proposed Big Bend area, there are existing canopy trees in certain areas that create a buffer that we either want to maintain and enhance, such as the western portion of the southern boundary adjacent to Tuscany Park. There's an existing large canopy area right there. But then there are other areas that don't have that same large canopy now, but would really benefit from that similar separation. So that would, as we go east along the southern boundary here, adjacent to some of these other properties, kind of near where their existing tennis courts are, that area doesn't have a lot of landscape canopy or other visual buffers. And so that's where we are proposing to extend that transition zone, which would require some new plantings in order to maintain it. And then along Big Bend, we're protecting the existing tree canopy that's provided here. And that's going to be proposed with a 100-foot setback. On the northern end, we have proposed a transition zone of 90 feet for the portion that's adjacent to Hillcrest. So again, that's protecting and enhancing some of that existing transition area, but we are not requiring the transition zones between the adjacent institutional neighbors. So setbacks, this diagram shows us a comparison to our existing setbacks, which are the dashed line here on the diagram and the proposed ones. So this zooms in a little bit more on the previous diagram for the transition zones. So currently our setbacks are based on the R2 regulations, which really have setbacks created for most of our R2 lots, which are 60 feet wide or maybe 5,000, 7,000 square feet in area total. This site is significantly larger than that. So under our current code of R2, the side yard setbacks would be 15 feet, and that's the maximum. So it would go up from there if they were trying to build a 110-story building, but not significantly different depending on what they wanted to build. So here we're proposing to align a lot of the setbacks with the transition zones that we just went over. The exception areas would be along the boundary that they'll share with Concordia Seminary, where we have some setbacks that will really reflect what Concordia Seminary could do on their side of the property with their new residential halls. And then along the north up with Fontbonne. And the other piece that the setbacks really address in the overlay that's not covered within our existing code is how setbacks would apply to things like a surface parking lot or an athletic field. So right now, our setbacks in our existing zoning language are tied to buildings, and in a few instances, such as a front yard setback, it says that surface parking would not be allowed in that front yard. But what we've done in the proposed overlay is really clarify the setbacks that we would apply to a surface parking lot as well as an athletic field, especially given the use of this proposed area is primarily athletic fields. Tree requirements. So we heard a lot from neighbors about these as well and protecting that canopy, as I mentioned. So currently, the requirements for tree and landscape are based on caliper inch replacement. So if they were to take down a tree associated with a development project, then they would need to plant a certain number of caliper inches. What we're proposing is transitioning to a canopy coverage percentage, which is how we regulate a lot of our residential uses across the city today, but is also a better way to regulate given the intent of how they want to use the property. So the athletic use is going to take up a lot of area where we won't have large trees that will add to the canopy coverage, but we want to make sure that we're still maintaining a minimum canopy level because that better addresses what our long-term goals are for reducing heat island effects and providing that buffer zone for our residential neighbors. So we did an analysis with the help of our contracted landscape architect for the city to look at the existing buffer that's provided within those transition zones on the setback or on the property today, and then what could be enhanced in areas where there's not a lot of canopy coverage, and recommending 20%. And then we also have some existing items within our tree and landscape regulations that would continue to apply with relation to this mixture of species, native percentage, et cetera. In addition to just the canopy coverage requirements, we're also proposing for the Big Bend overlay established tree growth areas. So these areas are specifically highlighted here, outlined in this darker green color. We used the survey of the property that was provided by Washington Concordia that identified the location of trees and their size today. So we use that along with information about the grading existing on the site and the location of other infrastructure such as buried sewer lines, electric, other items that will either need to be removed because they serve those existing buildings today that would be removed, or are likely locations that there would be additional work on the infrastructure. And what we've done is cut out these established tree growth areas and put additional protections on these in particular. So you can see in some portions, they extend beyond the transition zone requirement. And then in other areas, they're completely within the transition zone. So this further limits what any development activity would be allowed within those areas to protect those existing canopies, and then also enhance them should they need to replace additional trees. So attached to kind of the operations and the physical development, there's a few other standards within the overlay district that we wanted to highlight. The first being lighting. So one of the items that we're doing here within the overlay proposed is requiring the dark sky sports lighting certification of their fields. This will give us an additional tool at the disposal of the city. Dark Sky has a program that includes review of proposed plans with lighting, and they'll make recommendations to maintain kind of dark sky standards. And then they also have an inspection process with the certification that will bring another layer of knowledge beyond what our current building inspectors are trained in. Right now, the city contracts with St. Louis County for our electrical inspections. And so lighting is not an inspection type that our inspectors are typically dealing with on a daily basis. So the existing certification program that Dark Sky provides, I think will really benefit our community in terms of the end result. In addition to that, we're modifying what the allowed lighting times are for the fields. So currently in our code, we allow lights to go until midnight on fields, and then they need to be turned off about 30 minutes after the end of an event. So here we're proposing to limit those times from that to 7 a.m. to 10:30 p.m. So that's when the field lights would be allowed to be used. In addition, we have modified from our existing lighting standards in our code, the maximum horizontal light levels. So we're recommending 0.5 foot candles at the property lines, and this is equivalent to a full moon. So this is a very measurable number for us. If we stand on the property lines, we feel that in combination with the transition zones, the screening requirements, dark sky principles, the goal is really to make the lighting once you get to the edge of this overlay district essentially not noticeable. The maximum field lighting height is 80 feet. This one can sometimes be a little bit hard for people to understand, but if we look at our angles, we actually want to support some taller light poles because that will allow the lighting to be directed over the fields. And so they can more efficiently light the areas that need to be lit and not have that spillover effect. So while you're standing in a property, maybe at the other end on DeMun, you might be able to see the tops of the light poles, but the actual light itself wouldn't register there because it's, again, directed more efficiently at the field that they're intending to light. And then separating out the light poles that would be serving roads or parking lots or pedestrian paths and those sorts to a shorter level. Noise, this one is one that we currently, similar to with lighting. Right now, we allow outdoor games and music until midnight. So something that we're proposing here, again, to tighten up the noise restrictions within the overlay is to align the music with the lighting regulations. So that would end at 10:30 p.m. Another requirement that we have is for primary and secondary speaker systems. And this is really, again, to impact the operations of how the property will function. So recognizing that during a baseball game, for example, there might be people that are listening and watching the game, and there might be an announcer or somebody who's talking during that game to update and educate the crowd, but we don't need those same features when somebody's practicing. So this will require on the front end, the city to understand, and also for the user, Washington University, to have a plan for how they handle those events separately when there's an event that's geared towards an audience and when there is not. And then we also are proposing to cap sound levels at 80 decibels. So this is for steady noise and 70 decibels for repetitive noise. So for this one, the city borrowed some noise equipment from another municipality and actually went out and took readings on site. So you can see the pink dots represent the locations here where noise was taken. And looking through at the results of this, you can see our proposed levels of 80 and 70 kind of fall pretty closely to the conditions that are there right now. So the noise coming from Big Bend is actually probably louder in terms of a noise reader than most people think that it is. So on the table here, it shows the time when these measurements were taken, the conditions of the day when they were taken, and then what the reading is. I'll let David go into the traffic.
Okay, so another big question we had, especially as it relates to access, is what is the most efficient access point for the site? And whether or not there would be any changes to Big Bend Boulevard that would be required to facilitate this change in use. And so just as a little bit of background, we did have a traffic assessment performed, and that was performed by CBB and their transportation engineering firm that we've used numerous times throughout the city for projects. So they have really good supporting information already for the city of Clayton. But we wanted to make sure that the counts they were using were as recent as possible. So we actually had them go out and get new traffic counts on Big Bend. So what's the traffic level on the main artery itself, but also what are the turning movement counts at the key intersections? So that would be Big Bend and Southmore, Big Bend and Oak Knoll Park, Big Bend and Wydown, and then at Clayton Road as well. And so we've got updated numbers for all of those intersections. And then we assess the traffic demand for the conceptual athletic uses that are proposed by Washington University, and then made recommendations to mitigate any impacts. So that's what the engineers were looking at. How many people are typically going to a baseball or softball game? We gave them that type of information, what we could expect as far as events are concerned, so they could plug that into their models and see what impact that would have on the roadway. Ultimately, their findings from the report were submitted to St. Louis County, who agreed with the findings. However, any improvements that actually go on the ground are going to require additional studies. So when we know the specific uses and how the site will be laid out and how many seats there would be for baseball or for softball, or if there's seats inside the gymnasium, how many seats there may be there. As soon as we have an idea specifically of what kind of trip generation we're going to get on the site, we'll need to submit that again to St. Louis County for one last look before they would actually approve any improvements. But initially, on its face, they agree with the assessment that's been provided and performed to date. And so the findings of that analysis found, first of all, that the entrance traffic signal, and so that would be on Big Bend, is not warranted during normal conditions. So if there's no event going on, and when I say event, I mean a baseball or softball game that may have spectators on the site, if it's just intramurals or practice, there isn't enough traffic to warrant a new signal anywhere on Big Bend. However, if there is any sort of event on the site or spectators on the site, they found that it would be necessary to have a traffic signal in order to have safe and efficient egress. So people leaving the site. So you can, picture you've got a baseball game with a couple hundred people there. The game is over and everybody gets in their car to leave. Anybody who's tried to turn left out of any location on Big Bend knows that it's difficult. So you would have those cars stacked up and having to wait in order to turn onto Big Bend. And of course, that creates dangerous situations because if they're waiting too long, people typically get impatient and they try to shoot gaps in the traffic that causes even more concern. So the county, upon seeing this study, was in full agreement that a signal would be warranted for those types of events. So when we're talking about a signal at that particular site, that signal would need to be activated in order to turn red on Big Bend. So if there's not a car trying to turn onto Big Bend out of this site or out of Oak Knoll Park, then the light would just continue to be green on Big Bend. So it shouldn't have any significant impacts on the flow of traffic, which is one of the key things they were looking at. So the proposed alignment for that traffic signal is at Oak Knoll Park. The nice thing about it is it's a nice straight shot across Big Bend where you could align that entrance. We also looked at Southmore South a little bit, but you start getting really close to Wydown. It just doesn't work as well as far as the layout. Plus on the other side of the street, we've got some alignment issues there. So Oak Knoll really is the ideal place to have that traffic signal. Another reason that the county looked upon this analysis favorably was the fact that signalized intersection creates a safe crossing at the mid block on Big Bend that we don't have right now. So right now, if you want to cross Big Bend, you either have to do it at Wydown or Clayton. This would give pedestrians and cyclists a place in the middle of the road to actually cross. So if you're going to Oak Knoll, you don't have to go all the way up to Wydown or all the way down to Clayton in order to make that crossing. And so it's protected because you have the signal there. You could activate it with a button. That's something that's ideal. And then along with that is a proposed left turn lane that would go into Oak Knoll Park and a center turn lane from Oak Knoll Park up to the Southmore South entrance. And so I'll show a diagram in a minute that really illustrates why that's important. And then finally, we made sure that the proposed changes as far as the left turn lane and the center turn lane, along with the traffic signal, we made sure that those wouldn't have any negative impact on traffic progression. So again, making sure that if you put a signal here, you don't start to have traffic backed up in other locations, or people have to wait through multiple lights in order to progress north or south on Big Bend. And that was the case here, that this would not have significant impact. So here's the current condition, which is 2 lanes of traffic going north and south on Big Bend. Here's the Oak Knoll entrance. And then aligning with that, the entrance to this site would be located right here, directly across from Oak Knoll Park. So you would have a signalized intersection at this location here. And then if you show that on a diagram, you can see the entrances to both of those sites. As I said, there would be a left turn lane that would be added for those turning left into Oak Knoll Park that are going north on Big Bend. So that does require a widening of the roadway that would take place on the Washington University side or the Concordia side of the site here, so to the east. But you can see the left turn lane for people making that movement. And then here's that center turn lane that would be on Big Bend, and it really serves 2 functions. People that are traveling north that want to turn into Southmore South, could actually get into that center turn lane and then make that movement. The nice thing is at those peak hours, if a car wants to turn left there right now, they have to wait in the actual travel lane, and they start to stack up cars behind them while they wait for an opening. So that's the current condition. When this turn lane goes, that car wanting to turn left into Southmore can actually get into the center turn lane and wait for an opening without stacking up traffic behind it. And we've got a question in the room. Let me give you a microphone real quick so that they can hear you all.
Will the current pedestrian and bicycle paths that go down Big Bend, will that be like reconciled so that
Yes.
people can still ride up and down easily there?
Yeah, that's a great question. That'll actually be significantly better. So what Washington University has proposed is to actually have a widened bike and pedestrian trail, or two of them maybe that are side by side, that would run essentially down from the Danforth campus through this. Run from the Danforth campus down through this site. So that existing sidewalk that's there would be removed, and in its place would be a nice wide, 10-foot path or so that would be much, much better for pedestrians. And then what we've talked about is if that's coming down, say you're going, if you're going southbound here and you wanted to get to the park and this is signalized, that would then, you would go ahead and hit the activation. You could then safely cross to this side, and then we could look long-term at adding something similar on the Oak Knoll side, and then get people all the way down to Clayton Road with a nice wide path, which we currently don't have. Anybody that travels this knows right now, and once you get to Tuscany, it gets really bad. You're basically in the roadway. I think that sidewalk there is right about 3 feet or 40 inches. So a nice 10-foot wide path at least that would go down Big Bend to replace that sidewalk. So great question. So those are those improvements. And again, that left turn lane into Southmore also acts as a left turn lane into the athletic facility, along with plenty of stacking. So we did find that the stacking is sufficient, even for those peak events, to hold enough cars that it won't impede traffic for people wanting to make a left turn into the site. So the next steps for this, and we're continuing with number one, that's why we're doing this again this evening at the neighborhood level, is gathering community input. So we had the larger meetings, we've been meeting with individual neighborhoods. We want to get as much feedback as we can. So we still, just like every other planning effort we have in the city, we try to direct everyone to engageclayton.com. Hopefully everybody's been to that particular site. You can find all of the information related to this proposed project, these proposed overlays. All of that is at engageclayton.com. There's also the opportunity to watch videos. So these presentations are recorded. You can see the presentations themselves, draft regulations. We upload everything there. But you can also sign in and leave comments, and we check those comments regularly. So that's what we're trying to gather right now. If you want to read through those regulations and you have comments or specific feedback, please leave those there, and we'll certainly take those into consideration. So we're continuing to gather that input right now, and we're doing that to finalize the overlay district regulations, which would then go before the Plan Commission and the Board of Aldermen. So there's really two steps in order to make the overlays happen. The first one is you have to establish the overlay district regulations within the municipal code. So these regulations that you see this evening on the screen would actually be in ordinance form. They would be in the code itself. So in order to do that, you would have public hearings. The Plan Commission would make a recommendation, but the Board of Aldermen would ultimately need to approve that. Once you have the overlay district established in the municipal code, the second step is to apply those regulations to the actual property. And that requires a change to the city's zoning map. So that goes through the rezoning process, which is, again, public hearings. You would need to go through the Plan Commission and also the Board of Aldermen in order to get that approved. And then while that would be going on and we would be considering the overlays, Concordia Seminary would apply for a conditional use permit to move the housing on their site to the central part of the campus. And so they don't have a phased approach to this. It's just a single permit that will suffice for them. So they would be going through that process at the same time we would be considering the overlays. So really we're looking at really a package here between all of these elements. And so with that, we've covered a lot of information, and I know a lot of this is redundant from what we talked about at the larger public meeting. But the purpose of tonight's meeting is to really get feedback on the overlays themselves. So any concerns about setbacks, heights, noise, lighting, anything else related to the land or the development itself, that you may have concerns with or want to hear more about, that this is really a great opportunity to have that discussion at the neighborhood level. So again, if you're watching online, and it looks like we have 3 participants there, if you want to use the raise hand feature in Zoom, then we can call on you and you're free to speak. So I'll open it up now for any questions you may have about any of the overlay district parameters or the developments. And I'm happy to jump back to any slide we may need. Okay, looks like we have one online. Hello, you should be able to talk now.
Will there be any changes when Washington takes over Fontan?
So at this point in time, they don't have any anticipated change to the use there. So Fontbonne will continue to operate the campus until the end of the summer semester in 2025. At that time, Washington University will take over the use of the property, but they don't have any proposed changes to those uses at this point in time. So for our purposes, since the athletic uses on the Concordia side are known, we're really focusing on those at the moment as far as the overlays are concerned. If there is any proposed change in use on the Fontan site, or there's some sort of long-term planning that needs to take place, then Washington University will engage the community and have that discussion. But at this point in time, there's no real plan for that property.
Also, I mean, you might not have the answer to this, but is Concordia making these changes because their student body is shrinking and they're trying to avoid the problems of lower attendance as Fontan is suffering from a lower student body ratio?
That's not my understanding. So my understanding is that, and we actually inspect the housing that's on that site. The housing that's there, even though it's only 20 to 25 years old, isn't in the best condition and is going to require a lot of reinvestment here in the near future. And I think they view this as an opportunity to rebuild that housing at a location that serves the student body a little bit better than what they currently have. So, it's not, while it's on the same property, as far as the proximity to the main campus, I don't think it's necessarily ideal for what they'd like to have.
Okay, thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you. Any other questions online or in the room? And there will be meetings in the future as well with Washington University. So, if there's questions specifically about what their intentions are as far as the uses or long-term, they could perhaps better answer that.
Thanks.
We have a
David.
question in the room.
Yeah, this is Becky Patel. So I have a question that I've heard from some residents as it relates to site access. So as our neighbor, Concordia has generally allowed us like free access to the property. So a lot of neighborhood residents use it as a walking path as part of their day and stuff. And so what I'm interested in understanding is, my understanding is that that is not something that they have to do because it is their property. And at the same time, it is a real benefit to our community in Ward 1. And so I'm interested in understanding if there are any mechanisms in zoning or anything that we could incorporate into this that would allow us to maintain that.
The way we tried to address it, because you're right, it's difficult, if not impossible, to require public access to a private site through zoning. But what we do allow is, as you can see here on the secondary item that's listed, we do allow unlimited access to the site for bicycles and pedestrians. So if there was a neighborhood that really wanted access to these properties, we would allow that. So We allow that condition to occur, but it's not something we could mandate. As far as Washington University or Concordia's thoughts about allowing that public access on a continued basis, I would need the institutions to answer that question. But the code as written here in draft form would allow that access for the community. Any other questions online or in the room? So on the CVC campus, it's not actually a part of the overlay itself. So the thought again is and it's only being utilized really for the athletic uses right now. So there's an intramural field, there's some gymnasium uses. I think the crew team practices there. There's some other things that they use it for that are recreational in nature. The intention is to take all of those recreational uses, so basically all the uses that you see on the site, and move them to this location. That then frees up the CBC site long-term for some sort of reuse or redevelopment. What that looks like is really unknown because we're talking about a long-term phased approach where I would imagine at least a couple of years for Concordia to actually construct the housing and relocate those students to the central part of their campus. And then probably another couple of years after that for the Washington University uses to move over there. And then that property really comes in play. But maybe that's something the university could speak to, but it's outside of the bounds of this overlay. And I will say one other thing. On the books right now, the city does have a special overlay district on that particular site that talks about redevelopment. So right now, the way the code is written is basically you could have some commercial uses on that frontage, but the back half of the site would need to be transitional, meaning you would need to transition from commercial to perhaps more like multifamily as you get into the neighborhood on that site. So that's what's on the books or in place right now. Any other questions in the room or online? Okay, if not, I want to thank everybody for tuning in or joining us here in person. Again, all of this information can be found at engageclayton.com. There's contact information for Anna Crane, our Director of Planning and Development Services, who's always more than happy to talk to anybody and answer questions. But we just want to gather as much feedback as we can. Look through those the draft overlays which are posted there. If there are any parameters that anyone has concerns with, we want to hear what those are so that we can try to address those as we move through this process. And again, be on the lookout for upcoming meetings with Washington University and Concordia to talk a little bit about their intentions on these sites long term. So I appreciate it. Thank you all very much.